Hello, everybody. In this video, I'm going to be introducing some very general concepts and definitions in metaphysics, which, in case anybody asks, is actually the best philosophical discipline that there is. So, metaphysics is where most of my interests lie. That's what I read about and write about and things like that, mostly. So, I just think it's awesome. Okay, now before we get into the actual philosophical content, I do need to address some, I don't know how common misconceptions there are, but if you notice, I picked this really sort of elemental and like quasi spiritualistic sort of picture here, because the term metaphysics does have a non sort of philosophical usage. So if you go to like a Barnes and Noble bookstore and they have a metaphysics section, you're going to find a lot of stuff on like astrology, uh, aura healing, like soul wellness, that sort of stuff. So years ago, one of my best friends was uh, he owned his own tattoo parlor. So I was just hanging out with him at the shop, and a customer came in that had scheduled an appointment, and we were just chatting. And he said, so what do you do? That whole thing. And I said, well, I'm a philosophy professor. And he said, oh, well, what kind of what kind of philosophy are you interested in? And I said, metaphysics. I do metaphysics, philosophy of religion, philosophy of science, that sort of stuff. And he says, oh, metaphysics. So you like hunt ghosts and shit? And I was like, no, I don't hunt ghosts. It's not like paranormal studies. I mean, I don't even believe in ghosts, so you can't hunt which doesn't exist. That doesn't make sense. But that's not what we're talking about here. Years ago, I got an invitation from it was like the International Academy in Metaphysics. It was an invitation to come get a talk at this school in metaphysics. They had gotten a hold of one of my papers and was like, we would love to fly you here and put you up in a hotel and wine you and dine you and everything. And then there was a list of suggested topics, and it was like the power of, maybe you could give a talk on the power of crystal healing or the nature of universal consciousness and all this sort of stuff, and where is the aura locate, all these kinds of things. And I wrote them back and said that's not the kind of metaphysics that I do. It's not the sort of metaphysics that I'm interested in. All right, so I'm not a crystal healer of any kind. I think all of that is bullshit. I don't think there's like any fact of the matter whatsoever behind all of that stuff. It's just a bunch of pseudoscientific superstitious nonsense, if you ask me. Okay, now, so in general, what kinds of questions are we interested in when we're talking about metaphysics? Okay, so one question might just be this: what does it even mean to exist? Now, and I don't mean in terms of what's the purpose of existence, or does existence have value? No, we're not talking about meaning in that sense. We're just being straightforward. So when you say of anything that it exists, what are you actually doing? So, to say that persons exist and plants exist and I exist and you exist, what are we actually predicating, if anything, to the object? So when I say I exist, right? Is existence a property that I have? Am I identical to my own existence? Am I constituted by what is this sort of thing? That we use exist in a predicate way linguistically. So what is it exactly we are predicating of a thing, if anything, when we say of anything that exists? Okay, so this may seem like a straightforward question which has a simple answer, but the answer is not actually that simple. All right, so take this example. True or false? Oops, got to go back here. True or false? Sherlock Holmes is a detective, right? That is true. So it is true that Sherlock Holmes is a detective. It is also true that Batman is a detective, right? Okay. Now, but what are you doing when you say Sherlock Holmes is a detective and that is a true statement? Okay. Um, a lot of metaphysicians are going to say, all right, well, in order for our statements to be true, they have to be true of something. So you can't have truth independently of what there is. So one way of putting it would be that truth is a property of statements, but it's not a property of facts. So the facts are what there are, the facts are a matter of the existing states of affairs. Whether or not something is true, that's a matter of the actual language that we use to try to describe reality, or the terms that we use. Whether the terms we actually use refer to actually existing things. So the general idea here is that something can only be true of something. So if it's a true statement that Sherlock Holmes is a detective, okay, well, what are we actually doing? So the property of being a detective uh, applies to whom? Well, it applies in this case to Sherlock Holmes. But if if everything that's true needs to be true of something, well, what's the candidate for having this property of being a detective? Well, Sherlock Holmes. So when you say Sherlock Holmes is a detective, you are actually saying, at least if you take this straightforwardly, you're actually saying there's an individual, Sherlock Holmes, which has the property of being a detective, right? Now, but the problem is only existing things can have properties. So non-existing things, which that term itself doesn't even make sense if you want to sort of take it to its logical conclusion. There's no such thing as a non-existent thing per se. There are existing things, right? So the very notion of thingness involves the notion of existence in the first place. So if it's true of Sherlock Holmes that Sherlock Holmes is a detective, Sherlock Holmes has the property or the feature of being a detective, well, it seems that Sherlock Holmes must exist then. So how can we say true things about Sherlock Holmes if there is no such individual as Sherlock Holmes, at least in terms of existence? Okay, now, but is there an actual Sherlock Holmes? Well, clearly no. I mean, there are people named Sherlock Holmes, I'm sure. I'm sure there are people out there that have named their children Sherlock Holmes, but there's a difference between being named Sherlock Holmes and being Sherlock Holmes. When I say Sherlock Holmes is detective by Sherlock Holmes, I have a particular individual conception of mind. Uh, the late 19th century detective who solves crimes in London and has a partner named Watson and is a martial artist expert and abuses various substances and things like that. Was played by Robert Downey Jr. in a couple of films, those kinds of things. I'm talking about the fictional character Sherlock Holmes, a fictional object. So Sherlock Holmes is an actual. No, there is no actual Sherlock Holmes, but there's a fictional Sherlock Holmes. So the name Sherlock Holmes refers to a fictional object. Okay, so some philosophers, well, quite a few philosophers on kind of this side of things are going to say, all right, well, if we're asking what exists, well, everything exists, but not everything is actual. So Sherlock Holmes, yeah, Sherlock Holmes exists. Narnia exists. All these kinds of fictional entities. They are all existing things. Why are they existing things? We know they're existing things because we can say true things about them. Since I can say true things about Sherlock Holmes, there must be an existing Sherlock Holmes. I can say true things about the kingdom of Narnia from the Chronicles of Narnia. So there is an existing place, Narnia, but none of these things are actual. They're fictional. So there are existing fictional objects, but there aren't any actual fictional objects. So these philosophers are going to make a distinction between existing and being actual. So things that are actual have something that existing things do not have. So everything exists, but not everything is actual. Okay. Now, On the other side, we have what are called actualists. And actualists, it's funny how they came up with that name. Actualists are going to say, no, when we use the word exist and we use the word actual, these terms are synonymous, they're univocal. So there's nothing to existence other than being actual. So to exist and to be actual is to be one and the same thing. There's no distinction to be made here. So when we say Sherlock Holmes is a detective, if we're going to say that any true statement needs to be true of something, the actualist is just going to want to um, not redefine, but they want to recharacterize what exactly this statement is true of. So if taken straightforwardly, it does seem when I say Sherlock Holmes is a detective, I mean that there's an individual Sherlock Holmes that which has the property of being a detective. So there's an existing Sherlock Holmes which has this property, and since only existing things have properties, right? Sherlock Holmes exists. Okay, now an actualist, one move they can make is say, okay, well, when we say Sherlock Holmes is a detective, uh, we can't sort of take that sentence straightforwardly because we're not actually talking about Sherlock Holmes, the individual. Why? Because there is no individual Sherlock Holmes, right? There is no actual Sherlock Holmes. And since there's no actual Sherlock Holmes, there's no existing Sherlock Holmes. You know what there is, though? There is an actual fiction written by Arthur Conan Doyle, right? So there is no actual Sherlock Holmes. There is no existing Sherlock Holmes. However, there is an actual fiction, or there is an existing fiction written by Arthur Conan Doyle. So when we say things like Sherlock Holmes is a detective, one way that we can understand this is say that sort of implicitly what we are doing, even though we're not explicitly doing this, but implicitly what we are doing is we're saying something true about the actual fiction. The set of actual stories written by Arthur Conan Doyle. So we're making um, what you would say linguistically is a sort of elliptical statement. Okay, so what we mean when we say Sherlock Holmes is a detective, if we want to give a more metaphysically robust statement here, it might be something like this. Okay, so there is an actual fiction written by Arthur Conan Doyle, and according to that fiction, Sherlock Holmes is a detective, right? So there is an actual fiction written by Arthur Conan Doyle, and according to that fiction, according to that actual existing fiction, Sherlock Holmes is a detective. Okay, when you use that sort of elliptical in language, when you use that sort of elliptical framework there, according to such and such, or according to so and so, such and such is the case, you don't need to analyze the proposition that comes to or comes after the according to so and so, such and such. You don't need to determine whether the such and such is true or false. Okay, whether or not the elliptical judgment according to so and so, such and such is true or false is just a matter of whether or not that's what it actually says. Okay, so let me give you an example. According to flat earthers, the earth is flat, right? True or false? True or false? According to flat earthers, the earth is flat. That is true. Now, the proposition the earth is flat, that is false. And I'm not even going to bother, creating a video arguing for that because anybody who takes science seriously, scientific method seriously knows that. So it is false that the earth is flat. However, it is true according to flat earthers, the earth is flat, right? So with those kinds of elliptical judgments, whether the according to judgment is true or false, has nothing to do with whether or not the proposition embedded within the elliptical framework is true or false. So, according to flat earthers, the earth is flat. That is true independently of whether the earth is flat is true or false. Okay? So, according to actualists, and not all actualists might use this kind of strategy, others might just say, well, when you say Sherlock Holmes is a detective, you're just saying something false. Why? Because there is no actual existing Sherlock Holmes. But the reason why other philosophers think that's a mistake is because it does seem I'm saying something true when I say Sherlock Holmes is a detective, Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father, Batman is identical to Bruce Wayne, so there is no actual Batman, there is no actual Bruce Wayne, so on and so forth. Okay, all right. Now, so that's a really interesting question in metaphysics, and a lot of pages have been written on this. Okay, when we say of anything that it exists, do we mean it's actual? Is there a distinction between existing and being actual? That's a really interesting and important debate, but that's not the main one I'm going to focus on here. So, the main sort of question we're going to focus on here with introducing metaphysics is what kinds of existing things are there? Okay, so if we had to divide reality up into different kinds of categories or different kinds of kinds or types, how many distinct categories would we need in order to sort of fully capture what reality is like? So if we wanted to create a list of categories or what's called an ontology. So, you would construct an ontology just when you make a list of the kinds of things and the individuals that you think are actual, that you think exist. Okay. Well, how many kinds of things would we need in our ontology in order to be able to account for everything? So now, but where we need to be careful here is because the fact that we can create categories for pragmatic or practical purposes, that doesn't necessarily mean that the categories we have actually match up to what's really there. So some of our categories might, and I'm sure this is the case, a lot of our categories which exist for conventional or pragmatic purposes would not actually correspond to objects in the world. Okay, so here's one that comes up in philosophy of science, for example. So take the predicate is hexable, which to say that an object is hexable means that it's capable of being hexed, right? Now, but when we talk about hexability or the propensity or the disposition of capable of being hexed, what is that? So my phone is hexable. My glasses are hexable. This t-shirt is hexable, meaning my phone and my glasses and this t-shirt are capable of being hexed. But when I say my t-shirt is capable of being hexed, is the capacity for being hexed an actual property that my shirt has? I mean, is that a property of my shirt and my phone and my glasses? I don't think so. But linguistically, when I say, well, yeah, my shirt is capable of being hexed, that doesn't mean that there's a property being hexable or the disposition to being hexed or the power to be hexed that I think my shirt actually has. So suppose all that's necessary to hex something is for an individual to go a booga 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 over it. Well, then everything is hexable. But the fact that you can take my shirt and go a booga 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 over it, that doesn't tell you anything interesting about my shirt, right? You're the one engaging in the activity. So I don't think the predicate is hexable, even if linguistically we can make sense of it. I don't think there's a genuine property in the world that actually corresponds to this predicate, right? Why? Because everything is hexable. So everything is the kind of thing you can go a booga 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 over, and now you can't unsee that or unhear that, right? So just because we use categories doesn't mean that those categories correspond to what's really there. Now, but when we're doing metaphysics, that's what we want. When we're doing metaphysics, we want categories that actually correspond to what is there. So we want categories of types and kinds and properties and things like that, where there's an actual correspondence between the categories and the language that we employ and what's actually there in the world. So hexable uh, is not a property of any kind of thing, or capacity to be hexed, or capable of being hexed, or is hexable, right? The fact that these things might make sense linguistically, meaning that we meaningfully communicate with each other when we say that something is hexable. That doesn't follow from that there's an actual property in the world, the capacity to be hexed or the disposition to be hexed, that objects in the world actually have, right? Okay, now, and when we're talking about kinds here, a lot of the times what we're concerned with in metaphysics are what we would call fundamental kinds. All right. So in this picture, I've just given some different kinds of, in physics at least, different kinds of fundamental forces. So we've got the electromagnetic force, we've got gravity, we've got the field of relative resistance, we got the electromagnetic field, we've got electromagnetic waves, and we've got degeneracy pressure and things like that. Okay. Now, so to the extent that metaphysicians or metaphysicists, whichever you want to say, are concerned with kinds or types that are fundamental, what do we mean by fundamental here? Okay, one sense of fundamental would be this, to ask about, okay, what kinds of things are there in a fundamental sense, would just to be asking what the most basic building blocks of reality are. Okay, so if we had to divide reality up into parts, into proper parts, and that presupposes that reality is divisible into proper parts. Some philosophers don't think that reality is made of parts at all. I'll get to that momentarily. But if we were to sort of divide reality up into parts, would we get to a point where we can't metaphysically divide reality up any further? All right. So an atomist is going to say, okay, well, eventually when we divide reality up, we're going to land on something which we can no longer divide. All right. Now, other philosophers buy into what's called gunk theory, and believe it or not, that's the actual technical term. And what gunk theory is the view that, fundamentally speaking, reality is made up of an atomless, sort of infinitely divisible kind of stuff, right? So when we're doing metaphysics, what we want to know are okay, what kinds of stuff, is reality made of? So is there an atomless stuff that is kind of infinitely divisible, that everything in reality is composed of or constituted of? And that's an important difference that I'm not going to get into here. Or is reality fundamentally atomistic? So is there a fundamental kind of thing which is indivisible, or is reality infinitely indivisible? All right. Okay. Now, another sense of fundamental is this notion of being explanatorily primitive. Okay, so explanatorily primitive. All right. Now, so here in this picture, I've just got what we could call a pile of candy, right? So the question here is whether or not there are any such things as piles. So are there piles? So when you've got a certain amount of candy, do you have a pile? And if you start removing pieces of candy one by one, like is there a determinate point you would get to where you no longer have a pile? I mean, are there such things as piles? Okay, let's assume for the moment that there are piles, though. So what explains piles? Well, in this case, we have a pile of candy, right? Well, is the pile simply individual pieces of candy that are arranged in certain ways, or individual pieces of, a determinate amount of pieces of individual pieces of candy that are in contact with each other? So if I take 4 pieces of candy and have them all touching each other, is that a pile? But what if I spread the pieces of candy out so that they're no longer in contact with each other? Well, is this is it a pile, but it's a separated pile? Is it a disjointed pile? I mean, so this notion of pileness, what does it even mean? Now, but if you want to say, well, a pile just is really individual pieces of candy that are in contact with each other, okay, well, that means that you're using the individual pieces of candy and in one sense plus their arrangement as an explanatory primitive. So what are piles? Well, piles are just sort of a secondary phenomena here. All right. So when we have a pile, we have what we could call sort of a second order or a special case, a second order case of a more fundamental case. So piles really just are individual pieces of candy that are arranged in certain kinds of ways. There's nothing to piles other than the individuals plus the arrangement. Now, if you take that line of thought, you're saying that the higher order complexity, the pile, is explained in terms of a lower level reality, a more fundamental level of reality, the individual pieces of candy. And if you want to say that the arrangement of the pieces is something distinct from the candies, that there are arrangements and there are individuals, simples that we can quantify over, be my guest. But what you're doing anytime you want to explain a higher order or a higher level complexity in terms of things that are of a lower level or of a less complex or simpler reality, that's kind of what you're asking for here, or that's kind of what you're after here. Okay, now, but to say that something is explanatorily primitive means this. If a given level of reality is explanatorily primitive, that means it's basically a basement level of explanation. So if a given level is explanatorily primitive, that means we don't have anything simpler that we can explain that level in terms of. So if I explain level 3 in terms of level 2, and I explain level 2 in terms of level 1, level 1 would be explanatorily primitive if there's nothing lower to explain that level in terms of. Okay, so let me give you an example. A lot of philosophers think that the identity relation is primitive. So to ask the question, okay, well, what does it mean for things to be numerically identical, right? Here's how we could run this. Okay, well, what does it mean for things to be the same, not in a qualitative sense, but in a quantitative sense? Well, to say that things are the same, numerically the same, means they are numerically identical. Well, what does it mean for things to be numerically identical? For them to be numerically the same, right? The notion of numerical identity seems to be a primitive, meaning you can't really explain it without invoking the very concept itself. Okay. All right. And then the last question I'll mention here is what is it exactly that persists through change? So to the extent that we at least seem to perceive a world which is changing, can things survive change, or is change just a word that we use to describe, certain kinds of things ceasing to exist and then other kinds of things become, coming into existence? All right. So here's one example. Do caterpillars change into butterflies? Meaning, is it true that every butterfly was once numerically identical to a caterpillar? Or are caterpillars and butterflies completely different kinds of things? So when we say caterpillars change into butterflies, is what's really happening here a caterpillar ceases to exist and then a butterfly comes into existence, right? So there's a difference between saying caterpillars change into butterflies, meaning that every butterfly was once numerically identical to an individual caterpillar. Every individual butterfly was once an individual caterpillar, meaning that every butterfly was numerically identical to a caterpillar. Or when we talk about change in this sense, do we really mean, well, one kind of thing, a caterpillar, ceased to exist, and that thing ceasing to exist was a necessary condition for the other kind of thing coming into being? So clearly, the existence of butterflies depends upon the existence of caterpillars. There would be no butterflies without caterpillars. But just because the existence of caterpillars depends upon, or I'm sorry, the existence of butterflies depends upon the existence of caterpillars, it doesn't follow from that alone that every butterfly was at one point in time numerically identical to a caterpillar. Okay? All right, now in the next video, I'll be going over some more terminology here. So stay put, and I'll see you then.